The map doesn't change with a vote anymore, it changes with pressure. And right now the United States is doing something unthinkable inside NATO, issuing a territorial ultimatum to an ally, not as a request, as a deadline. President Trump said it out loud. We're going to be doing something with Greenland, either the nice way or the more difficult way. That sentence isn't diplomacy. It's a lever being pulled, a lock being turned, because Greenland is not just ice, it's a watchtower, a choke point, a supply chain for the next era of war. And if Washington believes Russia and China can wrap the North Atlantic in steel, then loyalty becomes negotiable. If you want the next 10 minutes to explain the next 10 years, subscribe now, because this isn't about buying land, it's about controlling the board. Now let's name what's really being taken. You're being told this is about defense, about radar, about missiles, about the Arctic. But that's the surface story. The real story is that Greenland has become a test case, a test of whether borders still mean anything when a superpower feels cornered, because the United States isn't asking politely, it's signaling that it can rewrite ownership inside its own alliance system. And once that door opens, every treaty becomes conditional. This is why Denmark is panicking, not because it can't defend an island, but because it may be forced to negotiate its sovereignty like a subscription fee. And this is why Europe is scrambling to offer everything but territory, more spending, more access, more troops, more loyalty, because they understand the new rule. Protection is no longer a promise, it's a price. And the invoice is being written in ice. Now we need to understand how we got here, and why this island is worth breaking the world's map for. For most of modern history, Greenland was a blank space in people's minds, a frozen outline on a classroom map, too cold to matter, too far to fight over. But the Arctic was never empty. It was simply locked by ice, by distance, by time. And now the lock is opening. As the climate shifts, the region stops being a barrier and becomes a highway, a resource shelf, a weapons platform. That transformation changes the meaning of geography, because security is not just about armies anymore. It's about sensors, minerals, ports, undersea cables, missile arcs, and who gets to place them first. This is why Russia spent decades building an Arctic fortress, why China tried to enter through infrastructure and mining, and why the United States is suddenly talking like an owner instead of an ally. Greenland didn't get more valuable overnight. The world around it got more dangerous. Now comes the first spark. The moment this stopped being theory and became a confrontation. It starts with a line in the ocean that most people have never heard of. But every admiral studies it like a heartbeat. The GIUK gap, the stretch between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. On a map, it looks like geography. In reality, it's a gate, because it's the only exit route for Russian nuclear submarines leaving the Arctic, the only corridor to slip into the North Atlantic and threaten the U.S. East Coast without warning. That's why this gap has a nickname, the kill zone. If you control Greenland, you control the sensors, the sonar nets, the patrol routes, the interception window, and suddenly the North Atlantic stops being open water. It becomes a trap. This is the terrifying logic inside Washington. Without Greenland, the watchtower is blind. With Greenland, the Russian fleet is boxed in. So the pressure ramps up, not with negotiations, with coercion. And that's when the strategy turns darker. Washington didn't treat this like diplomacy. It treated it like extraction. A special envoy to Greenland, not to Denmark, not through Copenhagen, directly. That wasn't an accident. It was a message. You are not negotiating with the kingdom. You are negotiating with the asset. And once you frame territory like an asset, you unlock a different playbook. Pressure, humiliation, deadlines, threats that don't sound like threats. Trade becomes leverage. Tariffs become a weapon. Markets become a hostage note. Because the White House isn't just saying we need security, It's saying your economic stability depends on obedience. And then comes the bypass move, a compact of free association offered directly to the island. Money for loyalty, aid for exclusivity. This is why it feels like a Godfather strategy, not partnership, protection. And if you refuse protection, the consequences are designed to hurt. Now watch what happens when China enters the frame. For China, Greenland was never a flag to plant. It was a foothold to finance, a quiet entry through contracts, airports, mining rights, infrastructure with dual-use shadows. Beijing even called itself a near-Arctic state, a phrase that sounds harmless until you realize what it means. It means the Arctic is not yours, not Europe's, not America's. It is a market, and China intends to buy a seat at the table. That's what the Polar Silk Road really was, not exploration, positioning. So when Chinese state firms tried to fund airports and secure strategic sites, Washington read it as a countdown to a future base, a future radar node, a future lever pointed at North America. And the U.S. response became absolute, not negotiate with China, evict China. Pressure on Denmark intensified, deals were cancelled, licenses were shut down, access was denied. The message was simple. The Arctic is close to Beijing, but here's the twist. The U.S. wasn't moving because it was strong. It was moving because it felt late. Now look at Russia, and why the panic in Washington is real. In the Arctic, Russia is not improvising. It has been preparing for 20 years. While the West debated climate and trade, Moscow built an ice fortress, nuclear icebreakers, military bases, runways carved into nothingness, missile systems placed where weather itself is a weapon. Bases like Alexandra Land can sustain troops for 18 months without help, not as a symbol, as a forward operating machine. And the Russian Northern Fleet is not a side project. It represents 2/3 of Russia's naval power, headquartered close enough to matter. That's why Washington sounds desperate, because in this region the U.S. isn't dominating, it's chasing. America struggles to keep even one heavy icebreaker operational. Russia operates the world's largest fleet. So when Trump talks about Greenland as an existential necessity, he's describing a brutal truth. In the Arctic, time is a weapon, and the U.S. believes it is behind, but the real blast radius isn't in the ice, it's inside the alliance. Because the moment you threaten a friend, you expose what NATO is made of. And that's when Denmark realizes it isn't in a negotiation, it's in a shock test. Danish officials called the approach unacceptable. They warned that an attack on Greenland would mean the end of NATO. So Copenhagen does what smaller powers always do under pressure. It pays over $4 billion pledged for Arctic defense. Long-range drones, missiles, surveillance, anything that proves loyalty. But the White House response is not gratitude, it's mockery. Trump dismisses it as buying one more dog sled. That line is not a joke. It's a signal. Nothing you offer matters unless you offer the territory. And humiliation is intentional. Because humiliation breaks resistance faster than logic. Denmark retaliates in the only way it can, symbolic defiance, excluding U.S. forces from exercises, signaling that trust is no longer automatic. This is what a cracked alliance looks like in real time. Allies start behaving like rivals in public, on purpose. Now Europe enters with a different strategy, not resistance, not surrender, a buyout, and it has a name. Europe understands a dangerous truth. It can't outmuscle the United States, and it can't out-argue it either. So it tries something else. It tries to pay. The strategy becomes everything but territory, unlimited access, more bases, more aircraft, more budgets, a blank check for American security demands as long as the map stays intact. And then Europe raises the stakes in the most serious way possible by putting boots on the ice, Troops from France, Germany, and Norway deployed to Greenland. Officially, it's support. In reality, it's deterrence. Because once European soldiers stand there, a U.S. takeover stops being a legal argument. It becomes a political explosion. This is what a standoff between allies looks like. Not speeches, positioning, bodies on the ground. Europe is trying to make the cost too high. Not in money, in headlines, in history, in humiliation. But there's still one factor neither side can fully control. A population of 57,000 people. A local government. A veto. And they've already said the words every empire hates hearing. We are not for sale. This is the part everyone in Washington wants to treat like a footnote. But it isn't. It's the hardest problem in the entire operation. Because Greenland is not empty land. It is 57,000 people. A government. A political identity that refuses to be purchased. They've said it clearly. We don't want to be American. We want to be Greenlandic. That isn't a slogan. It's a veto. And the irony is brutal. The island wants more independence, but it survives on Danish subsidies, a financial dependency that creates pressure points. This is the crack the U.S. believes it can widen, not with tanks, with incentives, with deals, with promises wrapped in security language. But local politics are not predictable. In 2021, an election effectively shut down uranium mining, stopping the very extraction the superpowers crave. So Washington faces a reality most empires ignore. You can't own a place that won't cooperate. And when persuasion fails, power reaches for a darker tool. Trade, blackmail, economic pain. And that's where this crisis becomes global. The Greenland crisis doesn't just reshape the Arctic. It reshapes the meaning of alliance. Because the most chilling message wasn't aimed at Russia or China. It was aimed at America's own friends. If the United States feels threatened enough, it will threaten you back. That's the new reality. A world where Article 5 is a principle until it collides with American strategic imperatives. Europe is being forced to accept a transactional system. Protection has a price tag, and the price is paid in obedience. Access, spending, silence, and Greenland becomes the proof of concept, a template for how power behaves when fear takes over. Not negotiation, not persuasion, control. Because in 2025, the zone of peace is gone, even inside alliances, even among friends. So the purchase might pause, the rhetoric might soften, the tariffs might be suspended. But the campaign has only begun, one way or the other. If this video clarified the new rules of power for you, like it, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Are alliances still real, or are they just contracts with an expiration date?